Richard, it's great to talk to you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nikhil.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. You mentioned that you always sang harmony as a kid. When did you actually come to music?
Oh, I was born into it because my father, whose name was Clem DeRosa, he was a professional musician. He recorded with Charlie Mingus and John Laporta and a few other, well-known musicians of the time. And but ultimately got into music education. He started in 1955 and was, if not the first, one of the first to have kids in public school. As a matter of fact, there's a record that he's got of 9-year-old kids playing Lester Leaps In. And so I was born into that,
So always from the beginning, just constantly in the house.
Yeah, music going on. I was singing C Jam Blues before I knew what the title was, So,
do you have absolute or perfect pitch?
I don't. And some people have asked me that because I think, most professional musicians have a lot of natural talent. Although I was just speaking with Maria Schneider. She just visited our school, and, she says that she doesn't really have a lot of natural talent, that she worked exceedingly hard. So, everybody's different, but certainly I think most people in music, if they're in the profession, have to a certain degree a natural ability or a very facile capacity to learn how to do things quickly and instinctively. So I believe I always start pitches, but you have to ultimately, because there are people who have perfect pitch, but they don't necessarily understand what the structure of the relationship of the pitches is. So even if you have perfect pitch, I think you have to really understand how those pitches work together in a tonal context. But for me, it was always practice of, singing, conscious awareness of sight singing, what it looks like on the page, interacting with the keyboard, and just I call it's like target practice, where how does somebody get good at shooting something, and whether it's a video game or a real, rifle range, whatever. So for me, it was really just always a diligent daily effort, I guess, to learn how to hear. And maybe that's, I don't know, to me, it just seems like it goes hand in hand with writing. If we want to be sincere writers, I think it's a worthy aspiration to really write what you hear rather than randomly throw notes together.
Now, your father was a pretty successful professional musician. What kind of records did you grow up listening to? Did you have a record player in the house? Did you listen to the radio?
Yes. Yeah, all of that, and so the radio, listen to popular music of all kinds. I remember that there was like the Beatles and things like that, and all of that rock and roll revolution that came to the U.S. But also, I remember my parents had a record with Doris Day, who was well-known band singer, and so I was learning standards like that. And then, of course, my dad had jazz records in the house, but we also had classical records. So I remember listening to Tchaikovsky, and again, as a little kid, I wasn't processing these things to learn the chronology of the music and the composers and so forth. It was really just a totally natural absorption of listening to music, and I think not putting any boundaries on it, which I think is really important. And to me, even though I teach in the jazz area at UNT, I'm sharing with my students, I'm trying to take down all these borders and say, look, it's the same 12 notes. I'm just working with my advanced arranging students. I'm showing them Bach. We look at a 2-part invention and a fugue, and then we're looking at Bartók and Stravinsky in small measure, to just get them acclimated to it.
Well, it's really fascinating that you have such an eclectic background, and I was really astonished at your education, because you really played. Let's start with maybe 7 years old. That's when you picked up the drum sets, and your dad was showing you how to play the ride and the pedals. So was that really your first instrument that you grappled with? I mean, other than your voice?
Yes. Pretty much, yeah. I think, and it's funny you mentioned that the voice, because that's what I tell my students. Like, look, your first instrument is the voice, and it's the one that you carry around with you should you choose to develop it. Which I think, even standing in front of a band, a lot of times, especially with younger students, when you can sing what you want, the interpretation of the music, and especially in jazz where rhythms are not always exactly played as they are seen. I think vocal expression is really important, and it helps the ear training. But the drums, from what my father told me, that was the first instrument, I guess. But then you also can think about, well, what little kid wouldn't be attracted to drums,
Well, did he want you, did your dad, because he's a drummer, did he want you to be a great drummer, or was he kind of free and easy?
He was free and easy. I think he waited long enough to see, okay, how serious is this little kid about the drum set? Is it just like your typical kid who wants to go bang on a set of drums, or you really want to learn? But I'll tell you a story that my dad, I guess I must have been about 11, and we had a piano, an upright piano it was a finished basement, which was our music studio. So I had the drum set down there, the record player, and an upright piano. And I remember one day I was just kind of fooling around at the piano, and my dad came up. He was a great teacher. It was very natural and casual. So he just said, "Hey, you know what? Would you do me a favor and play any two notes?" And so let's say I play C and G, and he goes, "That's a perfect fifth." And then I'd play E flat and G, and he'd say, "That's a major third." And of course, you start doing that, and he didn't explain to me what it is, but with a kid who's naturally inquisitive with, in this case, music, what's the little kid going to say? Hey, what do those names mean? And so he kind of introduced me to intervals in a very casual way. And same thing, like he had some score paper, and so he, showed me, how to write things down, and it was all very just really natural. And I suppose
he was your first teacher then, so he kind of taught you the rudiments of music.
Yeah, but he also didn't become I think he was smart enough to realize that, the dynamic between a parent and child is different.
Yeah.
So he gave me a local drum teacher so I could learn the rudiments. And then, and of course I was in music in school, so I had those teachers.
Well, in school, you mentioned that, you joined the concert band, but you were disappointed that the drum parts were kind of simple, so you picked up the trumpet.
Yeah. He happened to have a trumpet in the house, and that's kind of how it just kept. I think all of these things, ultimately, like with life in general, things happen. You don't realize why things, for better or for worse, seem to happen at a certain time, but your path is somehow being guided. So for me, ultimately, even though I still perform as a drummer and I enjoy it, I knew ultimately my path, I could be most expressive in a comprehensive way through my writing. And of course, I think, there's a lot of drummers who are writers today. So, but I think all of them have some comfort level at the piano, which is a pretty, I think, even for guitarists, it's funny, like when in my arranging class, I'll ask a guitarist, say, go to the piano and play your open strings on the piano. And what often happens is they play the strings an octave too high.
Right. That's right.
Piano, because they're used to reading
lower.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's my way of saying to the guitarist, look, I know you're comfortable on your guitar, and you're comfortable because you want to do harmony on that instrument, but you got to realize how much more limiting it is on that instrument compared to the piano. And so everybody, that's why I think in every school, at least, even on the classical side, every musician has to have some affinity with the piano. And in the case of jazz musicians, it's far more essential than, let's say, an oboe player whose goal is to play in an orchestra. That person doesn't need to necessarily have the piano skills.
It's interesting because it seemed like you played almost every instrument in school. Because then later you played marimba when you had when you went to junior high with the jazz band. But when you mentioned in the ninth grade, you did your first choral arrangement of Stevie Wonder's My Sharia More. When did you start arranging?
Oh man, I started, I think, something in elementary school. I seemed to have there was a little song or something, and it was always, well, here's when somebody says, how do I become a writer? I'll usually say, well, first of all, finish what you start, whatever that is, because you just need to complete things and live with the result, and understand that it's going to get better. But I think the other thing is that for people who want to learn or aspire to write music, it's important to write for what's available to you. It doesn't make any sense to write for woodwind quintet if those instruments aren't available. We all need to hear our music. So, and I guess that's another thing. Maybe it was because of how I was, how I grew up in the house with no boundaries. It was not this type of music is better than that. So I didn't think anything of it. It was like, well, it was a pop tune or a little jazz thing or whatever it was. Just as a little kid, I was had this voracious appetite to do stuff in music. And for some reason, you start thinking, well, I want to write. I do remember. Here's another thing I forgot to mention. I was so fortunate with my father because I'd be going to these jazz clubs and hearing music or jazz festivals later on as a teenager. And something else I also share with students today, especially because each of us has a virtual record store in our computer. So you can, readily pull up an audio file. And yes, there is YouTube video and you can see musicians playing, which can be helpful, but it's not the same as listening to music in a room and really feeling, or even better, going to a rehearsal, watching how an orchestra conductor rehearses and deals with the issues within the orchestra, or a big band conductor, whatever, even a small group, just that. And for students who are in these situations where they get to go to a summer workshop, let's say, that the rehearsal stuff is just, it's just so important. And even if for students who, let's say, if they're playing a piece of music that's really comfortable and they're on the verge of getting bored, for them to redirect their attention to how is the band leader rehearsing this music? How is he pulling together all of the various players so that there's a cohesive unit, not just a bunch of individual performers, but that all these performers are coming together to form a cohesive statement.
Right. Well, you mentioned getting players to play your music. What did you have any kind of instruction in music theory in elementary school? How did you know what note went with what note, and how did it all work harmonically? And how did you put that together?
Well, part of it was this gradual assimilation through listening, I suppose, and also the piano and my dad showing me little things like intervals and chords. And then I remember in 8th grade, I was really fortunate. We had a band director who was a jazz musician, but all the guys in my grade and a year older were into jazz. So we got together and we would play different tunes, and then I guess we wrote some things. And of course, the great thing about jazz is you don't have to write an epic thing. You can write a little blues, and get it up and make it become a composition.
Let me just jump in here, Richard. Did you have like big band scores to look at and that kind of thing?
I didn't get into that until later, I would say. I don't remember sitting down with anybody until once I got into high school. I became more aware of that. And I was fortunate to have one of my father's students who subsequently became a teacher in his district. He was about, 10 years older than I was, or than I am. And so he went to Berkeley, actually, and he had all of Herb Pomeroy's line writing notes and things. So he shared those with me. And, I had there was another guy who was several years older than I. And he was the guy who kind of connected me in a deep way through classical music and jazz, which I needed, because I think, even with another thing I always tell my students, like, look, you have natural talent. Natural talent is like the nature's soil. It will grow something. But if you fertilize and irrigate soil, you can grow many more things from it. So this is what each of us has a responsibility, if we choose to pursue it further, to attain the highest level possible, so that we realize that at some point our talent is going to bring us to a halt in its ability, and then we have to work to figure out how to get beyond the limitations of whatever our talent is.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You mentioned classical music, because I liked one quote that you said. You said jazz writers should study Bach because he was the master of counterpoint, and also, if you want more modern stuff, Bartók and Stravinsky for more modern counterpoint. Is that how you look at things like counterpoint? Is that a topic that's very important to you?
Yes, because as I tell my jazz arranging class, everything is, if we broaden the definition, I mean, classically, or the classical definition of counterpoint is lines against lines, bass note against melody, or bass line against melody, counter line, etc. But if we think about it, even from the standpoint of, and usually I use the Count Basie rhythm section to make the most vivid analogy, as far as thinking about counterpoint is sound against sound. And also, it's not just sound against sound, but it's simultaneous sound. So the difficulty for the listener is, or the challenge for the writer, is to understand, to try to empathize with the listener's perspective. Okay, we're going to throw 4 different ideas, musical ideas, at the listener at one time. So in the Basie rhythm section, you have the walking bass line, you have the comping chords in the guitar, you have counterpoint onto the drum set itself. You could have the hi-hat clapping on 2 and 4. You could have the bass drum supporting the bass line. You have the cymbal. You have free counterpoint, so to speak, in the snare drum. And then, of course, you've got Basie sitting on top of all of that, doing, admittedly more decorative type things, much more sparse. But if we take a look at it in terms of counterpoint of simultaneous activity, you've got, okay, well, the bass is working in the double bass registers, right? So the bottom 2 octaves of the piano. The guitar, even though the bottom 2 notes of the guitar are in the bass register, the guitarist doesn't use those strings. He uses the 4 upper strings, and he's working in the tenor and alto registers. And they're both playing quarter notes, but the bass is playing longer quarter notes, and the guitarist is playing staccato quarter notes. And the drums can be more active because it's not defined pitch, so therefore it won't get in the way of harmony, etc. And we haven't even gotten to all the horn stuff, right? When you start to look at sound, all these things, and how do we make all this simultaneous activity become clear to the listener? The other thing, ultimately, I would say, as jazz and even pop musicians, we tend to think very vertically because we have to, and we have to understand chords. And in jazz, it gets really, those vertical structures get pretty high because we're going from the root all the way up to the 13th potentially. And we get so used to looking at things vertically, which of course we need to, but ultimately those vertical structures go by so quickly that the listener doesn't process vertical as readily as horizontals.
Oh, that's such an interesting thing that you bring up, because recently people are releasing videos on YouTube about the 7 levels, the 10 levels of jazz harmony, and what you're saying is that there's a horizontal aspect to writing and to composing. Are you saying ultimately probably more important?
Yeah, because I'll give you a perfect example. Let's suppose there's an E in a very prominent spot in the music. Could be a melody, it could be just a high note that's being held, but that E is prominent in the listener's ear. And let's suppose you could have any chord that makes that E a chord tone, therefore palatable, right? Not only stable, but palatable to the listener. So let's go with F major 7. Okay, then let's suppose in the next bar, the next chord is going to be A flat minor 9. And so what I see very often is students will, that E, they'll have the E, let's say, as a whole note over the F major 7, and then there's a bar line, and now the next bar is A flat minor 9, and they put a rest there. And so what I say to them, look, you have what I call a cross relation, or an unpalatable memory of the E when the A flat minor 9 becomes the next sound that the audience hears. So now they're remembering the E, because the bar lines don't erase notes. That's the other thing, right? So for students to realize, just because you write a bar line and that E is no longer in that bar, the rest in that following bar, that you might as well have had an E tied to another E whole
right.
note, because silence only preserves the memory of the note. So and it's now you hear this unpalatable sound of E in your memory that's clashing with the sound of an A flat minor 9 chord. So somewhere that E needs to be resolved. And so there are these things that's the best example I could think of how when students are totally ensconced in this vertical visualization and hearing, and they haven't figured out yet that music moves horizontally.
That's very interesting that you bring that up, because I think traditionally in classical music, counterpoint and harmony were often a single topic. And I guess in the 20th century they kind of split up. But can you give an example of, a student who's probably thinking too vertically, and as a result the counterpoint is weakened, and as a result the piece is weakened? Yeah,
like for example, let's go to C major. Really simple, and you have a typical pop tune, let's say, sweet pop tune with only diatonic chords in the key of C major. So it might be C down to A minor to F major to G to E minor 7 to A minor, etc. Right, some kind of thing like that. So what typically can happen, especially with jazz musicians, because they can become pretty cavalier with extended chord color. It's like, oh man, I throw a ninth on all my minor 7 chords. Okay, well, let's think about if we do that. If we do it on the D minor chord, the ninth is E. That's the major third of the key of C. Totally cool. You could maybe get away with that. If you throw the ninth on the A minor chord, that's the B, that's the leading tone of C, it's in the scale, you might get away with that. You go to the 3 chord, you're on E minor 7, and now you throw in the F sharp. That ninth is going to stick out. And so there it is. It's like, the whole idea of the vertical. When somebody says, I always throw a ninth on my minor 7 chords, that's a vertical, that statement says that I'm only considering the vertical aspect.
How do you think of theory when you are composing, when you're writing? What's going through your mind when you sit down with a blank piece of paper? What comes first? Rhythm, melody, harmonic ideas? What goes through your mind?
Yeah, I keep 2 general tracks open. There's the absolute music track, which every accomplished professional needs to have. The absolute music track is really like I don't even call it theory, I call it grammar. Because if you want to tell a good story, you still got to have good grammar. And then maybe stylistically too. For example, like if an author is going to write a story about what was the frontier west of the United States, a lot of people back then didn't say isn't, they said ain't. So it's incorrect grammar within the English language, but it's stylistically appropriate for the character and the story. So there sometimes style factors into it. But the idea of the absolutism of music in the sense of scales, chords, tonality, functional harmony, diatonic, chromatic, etc. Categorization of dissonance, meaning, let's say, okay, this chord is going to be this particular chord you're on, and then the next chord, is it going to be more dissonant or is it going to be less dissonant? And are you aware of that? And do you want that? That the power of intention rather than randomness is to understand what the effect of our choices are. And with accomplished writers, every choice is feasible. It's all, there's unless somebody makes a simple human error, which of course can happen, but artistically, nobody, when you ascend to the professional level, you're not making choices that are going to be questionable. Now it's just a matter of, you could do 4 things, let's say. Which one of those 4 are you going to do and why? So now we get into what I call the programmatic aspect, and I realize that maybe the strict definition of program music is it's the music that is attached to a specific story. I'm broadening that definition, that even when you listen to, a composer's Sonata No. 2 in B flat major or F minor invention, you can have some kind of stock title that doesn't depict any sense of emotion. Nonetheless, there's an inherent emotion in music. We can feel it getting brighter, getting darker, getting more tense, getting more relaxed. We can make it graceful. We can make it agitated. We can do all these things. And so when we can open up the avenues of communication so that we start to feel how music reacts as human beings, it helps us to make choices, I think.
How do you narrow down because you have such a vocabulary in your brain, how do you narrow down the choices? I suppose it's probably due to the job at hand, but maybe if we take, let's take as an example a jazz big band composing or arranging opportunity. So for instance, like the jazz at the Lincoln Center, if you're going to compose for them, Richard, why don't you write something for us next week? How would you go about doing that?
Okay, so when somebody asks me for a composition, I try to, because writing a composition is in some ways more difficult than an arrangement. The reason is because with an arrangement, there are already some parameters in place. Just the fact that I want you to arrange such and such a tune, we already know what the form of the tune is. We know the character of the tune stylistically, and we have a sense of thinking into the future, or there's a certain set of expectations. And so with a composition, I think it's important, or certainly helpful, at least for me it is, to try to get some sense of what the expectations are for the person who's hiring me. And so a couple of general questions could be, tell me about the players in your band. Tell me about, now for Lincoln Center, it's different because I know those people, but just let's bring it out to like just a general ensemble. So for your composers who are listening, these are important questions to ask. What's the size of your ensemble, and what's the level of players? That's a question that's maybe harder to get an answer to specifically because that could be a relative thing. Somebody could say, oh, we have a great band. Well, what does that mean? So in some ways, it's important for a composer to have maybe to be able to hear some examples of the performers, because ultimately composers, yes, we're writing for instruments, but really what we're writing for is people who play those instruments. And that's a huge distinction. It's like, what's the range of the trumpet? Well, we know what the bottom note is, but what's the top? And that depends on who's playing, right? And how high that person, what kind of range that person has developed, and then the ability to handle those notes with a certain personality, right? So there are things like that. that you could think of. You also could think of, what's this piece used for? What is the context? Who is the audience? How long does the piece need to be? How long do you want it to be? And even it could even come down to budget, because somebody could say, I want you to write a 15-minute epic work for orchestra, and we have, $1,000.
Well, okay, Richard, let me throw this at you then. Let's say you're writing for yourself, your artistic desires, and you have no limitations within reason. What would you want to write for yourself? And maybe we could even take like Neil, for example, that fantastic composition. Did you have practical considerations for that, or was that just purely music that you wanted to get out?
Yeah, well, that's a really special one, because that Neil was a mentor for me, and he's now 88 years old, and at the time, what was it, 4 years ago, so he was 84, and we've known each other since I was a kid. And, when we were both, I was living in New York, and so was he. And then eventually we did gigs together, and then he came down to UNT in 1981. And then eventually I got down there, but, time marches on. And so.
Was he a mentor to you?
Not like an everyday kind of situation, but yes, he was. I remember, as a young college kid, and as a matter of fact, I copied parts for his. He did a big studio orchestra thing, so and then he gave me opportunities along the way, and so forth. So yeah, he was always an inspiration, as my dad was too, but it's different, Anyway, so Neil and I, it was his birthday, and back then in 2015, it was in July, and he and I had dinner together, and then I just said, man, I want to write a piece for him. And then this idea comes. And so here's another thing, like what can generate an idea for composition is often a model given to us by another composer. So Neil and I always have enjoyed Thad Jones's composition To You. That soft ensemble type thing. And there are some other things, like even the classic Lil Darlin', that style of ensemble writing. And some other things like Bob Brookmeyer's great at doing that too. His first love song is a more contemporary, even though that was done many years ago too. But later in his career, he did that. That's a classic piece, if people don't know it, First Love Song. And then there was another one that he did 20 years earlier, 20 years or so. It's called, it's Django's Castle is the English version. But all of these pieces have this kind of lush, slow, the entire band all kind of nested in primarily the alto or mezzo-soprano range, and, soft and lots of dense harmony. And so, and then, I think you have to kind of have a point of view or enough of a context established to help get ideas going. That said, sometimes you get maybe a music idea that just comes to you, and it's like, man, I have to get this down before I lose it. And it's not even, it's like, I haven't had time to think about what this all means. I just need to get these ideas out.
Does it take you long to write? Are you a fast writer?
Well, I'm a fast arranger, and reasonably fast with composition, I think. But, again, arranging is different. I think the fastest one I ever had to do was for Wynton. It was an arrangement of this Ornette Coleman composition called The Invisible. And it was, I got the call on Wednesday afternoon, and then was speaking with Wynton about it. He was traveling. He was in a limousine traveling across the country. And so we're going back and forth. And so they had to send me the sketch of the tune and whatever. Bottom line is, it needed to be, they were going to rehearse it on Wednesday. And so that meant I had to start writing. I probably started around 6 or 7 in the evening, and I worked through the evening until 6 the next morning. And because the copyists have to have it, right? So, it's not like, I'm going to take 36 hours and work on the arrangement. It has to be sent to the copyist. So, and I guess the other thing for writers out there to realize is that you do the best you can with the time that you're given. And so there's that idea too of like being able to get things done, or if you're going to accept the job, then you're expected to meet the deadline.
Richard, you're a master orchestrator and you're really good with your instrumentation. Can you give some advice? What's the best way to develop orchestration? Are there books to read, certain model scores to look at?
Well, I looked at all. I think, it's funny. The world we live in today is, and this could even be for classical composers, because the technology has created two, let's say, sets of guidelines for orchestration. The traditional one is the orchestra is on stage, no microphones. And I use orchestra instead of big band, although we could use big band, but orchestra exaggerates the point because there are a greater variety of instruments and there's a greater imbalance of these instruments. We have brass that are way much stronger than strings, and the woodwinds are pretty light by themselves. Woodwinds can sound big next to just strings. A harp by itself can sound pretty loud, But when you put all these instruments together and you start listening to an orchestra naturally in a hall playing at a forte level, you're not going to hear the strings and the winds the way you would, let's say, on a recording, like in a film scoring situation where, to use, let's say, John Williams as an example. I'm not saying that they're, let's say, the London Symphony, that they're tracking everything separately. They're playing everything together, but through the use of baffles and close miking and careful, they have their options. So I'm sure they can mic the hall, so to speak, and get the natural sound of the orchestra as an ensemble. But they may also have some other ways where they can boost certain things. And certainly the whole idea of the studio orchestra came about pretty much, that in the Hollywood era of the late 50s and 60s, the idea of Henry Mancini using a section of flutes. And later on, Don Sebesky is a great orchestrator. He did all these wonderful projects for CTI Records. And that's an even greater example because now we're in the rock era. So now you've got rock drum kit, played by jazz players, but it's a harder hitting thing. And you've got electric guitars and Rhodes piano, and so you've got this rock rhythm section, and then you've got orchestra, and you've got the flutes, and Rudy Van Gelder was the engineer, and so you can just when you understand what the natural acoustic level is. Like flutes in a big band. Boy, if you don't write those flutes high enough, you're not even going to hear them. Or the brass need to be muted.
How do you get to know these things? What's a good way to learn?
That's why you want to go to rehearsal. Or for example, this is getting back to my point about, I'm listening to records. I'm listening to, especially nowadays, because if you're listening to anything post 1970, you don't know what you're listening to as far as what's been technologically manipulated or rebalanced. And this is especially true in pop music, right? Where now you've got this, overdrive guitar and reverb drums and, massive sounding stuff. And there are the strings right in there. You can hear every note the strings are playing. And yes, admittedly, strings can be mic'd in live, but to go and hear music in a rehearsal or in a hall with no miking, that's really how you learn how to balance. So getting back to the thing about orchestration books, this is why it's important to read. The first one was Rimsky-Korsakov, so you could look at that. Walter Piston, orchestration book. Samuel Adler, Kent Kennan. There are these classic orchestration books that talk about the instruments without any aid of technology. And then you have something like Henry Mancini's Sounds and Scores, which is dealing with the studio orchestra type thing. The other way to learn orchestration certainly is by studying scores, but I think in a way, like I'll use myself as an analogy, because obviously growing up in jazz and playing mostly in big bands. Even though I played in orchestra in high school, it's, playing in big bands, you get a pretty good sense of orchestration, and things balance more readily. Saxes, trombones, and trumpets, we're not really talking about great balance problems until we get into mute combinations and woodwind doubles, etc. But in an orchestra, you really kind of get to hear these things. And so as I became more aware of orchestra and yearning to write more and more for orchestra, I, like for example, the difference between an oboe and an English horn, that for somebody who's not that familiar with orchestra, that might be hard to tell on a record, let's say. And visually, okay, yeah, you can tell. Oh, yeah, that English horn is much longer, and it's got the bell is bulbous on the bottom compared to the oboe. So yeah, okay, you can see a picture of it. Big deal. So for example, if a student wanted to really appreciate the difference between oboe and English horn, they should find a piece that features those instruments, right? It's like strings and oboe. Let's say strings and English horn. The caveat being that a lot of times those pieces, a concerto especially, is usually a virtuosic piece, which is the cautionary aspect to that is be careful when you hear all these things being done on an instrument. That's in a soloistic virtuosic sense. That's not necessarily the best way to write for these instruments in an ensemble. So maybe the next level is to find pieces that showcase the instrument that you're interested in some soloistic way. And there's literature that says, man, there's a beautiful oboe solo in that piece. So you listen to it, even if it's just 10 bars, that might be enough.
Now, I forgot to ask you earlier about composing and arranging, but how do you get better at composing and arranging? Can you recommend anything, any materials or techniques that you would advise?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of books, certainly. I mean, one classic book for big band writing was by a gentleman who taught at the Eastman School of Music, or he ran the program up there. His name is Ray Wright, Wright, and he's been deceased now for quite a few years. But his legacy through his book is pretty amazing, and it takes you through three composers, Sammy Nestico, Thad Jones, and Bob Brookmeyer in that chronological evolutionary order. Another gentleman who's also since passed, Fred Sturm, Sturm. It's called Changes Over Time, The Evolution of Jazz Arranging. And Fred takes four tunes, I believe, like common tunes, like All of Me, Take the A Train, and he takes four arrangers over a period of time, some from different eras. And so that's a great book because it's score analysis, but it's deeper than score analysis. It's the fleshing out of the concepts within the score stuff. It's not just, oh, look at this voicing. There's a greater sense of, and in a way, Ray Wright's book does the same thing because Thad Jones, in Ray Wright's book, Thad Jones's music evolves out of Basie, but it's a little different. So it could be, to use a classical analogy, when you listen to early Beethoven, it sounds like Mozart, well, because he was influenced by that. But at the end of Beethoven's career, it's sounding more like starting to become more romantic sounding. And then, of course, Schumann picks up from that, as all these other guys, Wagner and whatever. And then Brahms is kind of like you can hear kind of a throwback to Beethoven, but there are some other things in Brahms's work that sound more modern. The same thing like with, let's say, Stravinsky's neoclassic period. So he's going backwards, so to speak, in the 20th century, but he's keeping the 20th century aesthetic to something that was, let's say an older style. And we do that in jazz as well.
You mentioned these great composers. What's the best way to learn counterpoint?
To me, the discipline, the more tonal the music is, the more discipline you need. because it's more exposed. It gets back to the thing of like, if you're in the key of C and it's really diatonic, don't throw a ninth on an E minor 7 because it's going to have that F sharp, or that chromatic note is going to stick out. And, to me, it's like, well, everything is feasible potentially, but if it sounds awkward or if it sounds questionable, and this is what's difficult sometimes for composers, especially composers compared to arrangers, because arranging music is like costume design or set design in some ways, I mean, there is, yes, the aesthetic of I'm going to take this tune and I'm going to do this wacky arrangement of it for me. But most arrangers, it's a collaboration that somebody is saying, I want you to take this song, I want you to put it in this key to be sung by this person, to be performed with this group. And sometimes it might be like, we have a band, but it's a college band, but there are weak players over here and there, and it's there's a lot of design that often goes into arranging. So, but if we use the analogy of set design or costume design, the people who they're doing artistic things, obviously, but it's within the confines of the greater story, right? So if you have a set design or even in movies, right? I mean, those scenes. Somebody's designing those scenes, and the producer or director, they're making the judgments based on the context of the story. It's not about, well, man, I want to stretch out and do my thing. It's like, no, you have to do our thing and figure out how to gratify yourself artistically. And also, for me, the idea is to take the art, or the pride in your artfulness is in having done the artful, artistic things, but within the confines of what's being asked of you.
Richard, we're rapidly running out of time. I want to ask you a couple of quick, fun questions. Don't think too seriously about the answer. All right, here we go. Top 3 jazz drummers, go.
Wow. Mel Lewis is great for big band drumming. I really love him. Shelly Manne, I always thought was great, so tasteful. Gosh, I always enjoyed Elvin Jones' swing feel. And of course, I mean, there's like Tony Williams. There's, Marty Morell with Bill Evans. I mean, there's so many. Peter Erskine, what a masterful musician.
Okay, how about top 3 jazz trumpet?
Jazz trumpet, wow. Well, gosh. Roy Eldridge was so great. Clark Terry, Freddie Hubbard, so different. Even Miles Davis in his own way. God, it's
too hard.
It's really hard.
How about
Kenny Wheeler? Man, there's so many beautiful ones.
Let me narrow this down. Okay, how about they're all hard questions. How about top 3 jazz arrangers?
Wow. Well, Thad was a real inspiration for me. Don Sebesky in a different kind of way, or more of the orchestra stuff was inspiring. Klaus Ogerman, gosh, gorgeous orchestra stuff. Those are 3, but there are many more. I mean, I think for, here, let me answer this way. When somebody says, what's your favorite color? To me, color is about context. So your favorite color sweater might not look so great on your car or on your bedroom walls, So in a way, when you like something, you might have to categorize it. Like, who's your favorite jazz arranger for blues? Who's your favorite jazz arranger for beautiful orchestration? Something like that. And then it's in some ways it maybe makes it a little easier to choose favorites. But that would be my advice to your listeners.
Well, let me jump to composers for jazz. Who are your favorites?
Wow. Well, Gil Evans certainly was really interesting. Well, Thad too. Maria certainly is wonderful, what she's been able to do as a composer in jazz. Man.
It's not easy.
Yeah.
Okay.
I like Klaus's. They're different, but really, there's a lot of great stuff out there.
If I were to switch to classical, who are your favorite classical composers? Top 3.
Well, Bach has got to be one of them, I would say, and I really appreciate Stravinsky. Let's see. Man, Holst was kind of nice too. I always enjoyed the planets. That's great too. Jeez.
Now let me go. There's too many to name, but look, how about this? I have another question for you, which is, can you name the piece of music that you found the hardest to arrange, and also another piece that was the easiest to arrange?
Wow. Yeah, well, it's funny. One assignment I had for the WDR for a Christmas program, and I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, but it's Lisa Rieselt der Schnee, or der Schnee, something like that. It's a German would know. It's a well-known Christmas tune. So I had no idea what it was, and it's only 8 bars long. It goes da 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 dee dee dee. I can't even remember the melody, but it's like some little ditty like that.
Yeah.
Diatonic major, 8 bars. And the director said, and I want it to be 10 minutes long as an overture. So what I needed to do was I paired it with it's a Ukrainian folk hymn, oddly enough. It's dum ba da dum bum ba da dum ding.
Oh, Carol of the Bells?
The Carol of the Bells. Thank you. Because I needed something else. I said, man, there's not enough material here. So that helped to merge those two. They blended nicely together. And so when an assignment like that, or for example, just in general, what makes an arrangement hard to write? When you have a monothematic short piece. Anytime you have that, you're essentially writing theme and variation. So that's another thing, like if somebody says, well, why should I study classical form? Well, sonata allegro we use a lot, but theme and variation is something that's really important. So you can see, you have to keep the continuity of the theme, but you need to come up constantly with an evolved variation. So anyway, I had kind of done what I could with this.
That's great for the hardest. What about the easiest to arrange?
Oh, the easiest to arrange. Gosh, I guess something that's got maybe like a jazz composer's tune, like maybe, and I hate to say easy, but like Wayne Shorter, right? There you go, Wayne, jazz composer, great jazz composer, Wayne Shorter. I was thinking big ensemble stuff, but no, Wayne Shorter is man, what a great composer. So yeah, he would be one of my top 3, I guess. And I've arranged
go ahead.
several, but I mean, there's so much content there, and it's good, and if he just orchestrated his composition and repeated it a couple times with some variation, it would sound like a nice arrangement.
What's your favorite instrument to write for?
Oh wow, gosh. That's again, it's like your favorite food. I love so many. Gosh, well, French horn is really nice. I used to play it, so I love writing for French horn.
Biggest regret in music?
Oh man, I don't know. I've been pretty fortunate. I don't know if I have any really. I mean, I guess you could look back and say, well, I could have done this better, or I wish I had, paid more. I'll tell you one. When I was touring with Jerry Mulligan, I was, young, in my 20s, right out of college, pretty much. And I didn't fully appreciate how great he was. I think I couldn't appreciate it. I was too young. But he's another one. Like when I teach my students on Counterpoint, we're looking at Bach, then we go over to Mulligan. Mulligan pianoless quartet. Why? No chords. So, and Jerry, I really respect what he did. He wasn't one to sit back on his, because he had early success. If you think about it, I mean, he was high school playing with Gene Krupa's band, and then, on The Birth of the Cool, and then had his quartet, and he was only 24. He was 24 years old. He was my age when I started playing with Jerry, I think, so, but yes, I think that would be a regret that I wish I had the way I feel about him today. Not that I didn't respect him, but it's just, I was too young to really appreciate, and that I wish I could have engaged more with him. I didn't ask him enough questions.
Now, on the flip side, what's your proudest musical moment?
Oh, wow. Well, there were some really nice ones. Well, I guess one of the big thrills happened just a couple of years ago when Wynton asked me to be a co-arranger with Vincent Gardner. We got to do the music of Bernstein to celebrate his 100th anniversary. And of course, Vincent is a superb trombonist. He's the lead player in the band. So I got to be the conductor. So I had the best seat in the house, getting to write and choosing some Bernstein pieces, which that was a difficult task. But I love Bernstein. There's another classical composer. I mean, that just for West Side Story alone, that's like, wow, what a brilliant compositional score, And so that was a thrilling moment to be at Lincoln Center doing that.
I guess as an arranger, you can really work with anyone's music. But if you could work with anyone in history that you haven't worked with before, who would it be? And it could be jazz, it could be pop, it could be anything.
Wow. Man, that's a really tough one. That's a real tough one. I love working with Wynton, so I mean, I've been so grateful for that. I just wish we could do it more, but every time I get the chance to do it, it's always great. Somebody of that caliber, I suppose, that maybe I haven't had a chance to do, but I've had some pretty nice ones, I got to say. Oh man,
it's tough.
I think as crazy as it sounds, Chris Bodie is a beautiful player. It's not necessarily, I mean, it's jazz, but it's just like just to write an orchestral arrangement for him, that would be nice, I think. But let's say a real genius player. Gosh, trying to think of somebody in jazz that would be fun. Well, maybe somebody like Wayne Shorter. That would be a kick to do a concert, to do arrangements of his tunes. I think that would be great. Yeah, that would be great.
I guess if someone in my audience heard this interview and was really excited to dive into your work, can you name a couple of 3 albums of yours or artists that you've arranged for that you would recommend that they start with?
Yeah, well, there's I released a CD 2 years ago. It's called Perseverance, and that is available on iTunes and Amazon, and that would give you a good example of compositions and arrangements for big band, although there's one original composition for orchestra. I was commissioned by UNT to write for them. That's a 14-minute work, but the others are all big band things, and Neil is on there, and Perseverance is this kind of epic big band work. And then there's another thing on there called Fugue for Thoughts, modern fugue writing with electric trumpet. So it kind of gets abstract. And then there's an arrangement of Infant Eyes, of course, Wayne Shorter, and then a wacky arrangement of Take the A Train and some other things like that. And then there's some YouTube stuff out on with my work with the WDR. Warren Vacher is one, Kurt Elling. But those are Stefan Harris. I think I've seen YouTube stuff on that. And I don't know, I was kind of hoping that, the Bernstein is available too. People can see that. If you see Bernstein at 100 with the Jazz Lincoln Center Orchestra. It's also on my website. You could go there and see, it's richderosa.com. And there's a page on there with publications. I have Sierra Music is up in Washington State in the U.S. And Bob Curnow is the director. He's an outstanding jazz composer and arranger who used to write and produce music for Stan Kenton. It's his company. It's a boutique jazz company, really great music. He publishes classic things like, Oliver Nelson. There's another one. Jeez, Oliver Nelson.
Yeah.
Great. And, Bill Holman he's published, if people are looking to get some arrangements of mine or whatever. But I would say those are, if people are interested I did a bunch of those records for Susanna McCorkle back in the 90s. And so if people are interested in small band writing, like 4 horns, 4 rhythm, and how to write for vocal, or they could hear some of the things that did a lot of different types of arrangements. That to me that's a good example of what I was saying about set design or costume design, is that Susanna had very clear images of what she wanted and didn't know anything about music. So whenever I interacted with her, we didn't even talk about music. So that's how important the programmatic aspect is. It's the same thing for people in film or theater. They're not going to know necessarily anything about music. So if you're trying to talk to them about the grammatical side of music, you might as well be speaking a foreign language. You're going to be relating to the dramatic aspect, which for hopefully most of us is we want our audiences to be big, which means that the vast majority are not going to be musicians. So
right. It slipped my mind, but just because you were studied under Neil Slater, there's another great composer who actually made this interview possible, Dr. Joseph Curiale, who made this connection. Are you guys friends? Is that Neil Slater collection?
Well,
is that firm?
Neil actually went to Bridgeport. I'm not Neil. Neil taught at Bridgeport, and Joe actually was a student at Bridgeport. I wasn't a student there, but I knew Neil separately, and I didn't know Joe until really only the last couple of years. And, but we became fast friends because of similar backgrounds, I suppose, in our connection to Neil. And, he's just a tremendous musician. You hear the work that he did, those 2 beautiful albums that he did with the London Symphony of his own music. And then his ability, all his experience in Hollywood. He's a great example. We have similar music careers in that sense that, we can write our own music, but we also have this ability to, and willingness. It's not just the ability, but you have to be in the mindset to be willing to, come in with a humble attitude of like, what is it that you need? What would you like me to do for you? Type thing. And Joe is great on that. And he does the MIDI thing like I do. And, we have similar broad aspects.
Now, the final question, I promise, the final question is is a music education one. And, you're really doing a great job in higher ed. How would you reform music education now that you're there and you're working in music ed? But, there's also pre-university as well. If you could really kind of maybe influence music education in a particular direction, how would you kind of hope that music education helps younger children and even in other higher ed situations?
Yeah. Well, I think and I think this is not only in music, I think it could be anything. When we pay attention to little, toddlers, you can see it, that they have a natural like towards something. They like certain toys, they play certain ways, they have different personalities. And as they get into the primary school, that continues, with subjects, and you can see where the students excel and so forth. So I think it's important for educators to first pay attention that, a teacher may set a curriculum, but the curriculum is a rigid thing that doesn't always resonate with each student. At the same time, maybe, if you're in a class of, you have 30 students in the class, obviously you can't have 30 different types of curricula to set it. So that's where private lessons can come in. So, and be helpful. But I think a teacher should be open and sensitive to to get to know the student. And at the same time, I think another thing is if children are wonderfully innocent. So if you tell them to be fearful of something or that this is very difficult, you're going to a place that necessarily they hadn't even thought about. So to say, hey, why don't you try this? Or, hey, just do things in a matter-of-fact way. And I think what makes a good teacher to me is, or what I'd be looking for, the qualities I look for if I were going to hire a teacher is, okay, yes, you need to have your knowledge in the subject, but what's more important than having even greater knowledge is to be able to, with the knowledge that one has, to be able to organize it effectively so that it can be taught. And then also the psychological aspect of how to deal with people. We all, as teachers, yes, we have to criticize, but if we do it in a way that wounds or insults, well, we're not going to get anywhere. We need to figure out, we're the adults in the room, so we have to figure out, okay, here's a student who has an issue. How can I what can I say to this student that is simple enough that the student will get it, and maybe also give him or her a critique that they're going to be able to maybe get some success with it right away. That's part of that savviness that the teacher needs to kind of understand, like, well, if I tell the student to do something that's way too difficult, we know we're setting the student up to fail. But if I can say, try this, and it improves whatever the issue is, even if it's incrementally, so be it. There's improvement there. And then you can say, you see how that sounds better? Or you could ask questions, Say, hey, what do you think? How do you think that sound? Did you like that? Do you think we could be, and just kind of have the student learn how to think and self-evaluate. And this kind of thing, I think, is a much healthier, more natural way to bring a student along. And even I'm teaching at one of the highest, most able schools in the world, not only for jazz, but also for classical. So we're dealing with highly functional students, but they are still young. Most of them are 18 to 22. And we need to be careful about, how we critique and balance, praise and criticism and nurturing. And then also be aware that sometimes we have to discipline. But the discipline, it should be in a way that is that has some humanity to it.
Right, right. It's great advice.
Not corporal punishment.
Well, it's fantastic advice. And the great Richard DeRosa, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your vast experience and your wisdom in music. And I'm sure my audience really, I learned so much. And I learned so much about arranging and composition. I really hope you enjoyed the questions. I had honestly had more questions, but we have to leave it here. Please come back again, and please, you're always welcome on the show. Thank you so much for all the great music you do, and I really look forward to listening to more of your future work.
My pleasure, Nikhil. It was nice to chat with you today.